Lady into Fox by David Garnett. Part 9. Narrated by Sana Najeeb. Oh, that night he was in this mood, and in agony, as if he had broken in the crown of a tooth, and bitten on the nerve. But as all things will have an ending, so at last Mr. Trubrick, worn out, and wearied by this loathed passion of jealousy, fell into an uneasy and tormented sleep. After an hour or two, the procession of confused and jumbled images which first assailed him passed away, and subsided into one clear, powerful dream. His wife was with him, in her own proper shape, walking as they had been on that fatal day before her transformation. Yet she was changed too, for in her face there were visible tokens of unhappiness, her face swollen with crying, pale and downcast, her hair hanging in disorder, her damp hands wringing a small handkerchief into a ball, her whole body shaken with sobs, and an air of long neglect about her person. Between her sobs, she was confessing to him some crime which she had committed, but he did not catch the broken words, nor did he wish to hear them, for he was dulled by his sorrow. So they continued walking together in sadness, as if it were forever. He with his arm about her waist, she turning her head to him, and often casting her eyes down in distress. At last they sat down, and he spoke, saying,
I know they are not my children, but I shall not use them barbarously because of that. You are still my wife. I swear to you they shall never be neglected. I will pay for their education.
Then he began turning over the names of schools in his mind. Eton would not do, nor Harrow, nor Winchester, nor Rugby. But he could not tell why these schools would not do for these children of hers. He only knew that every school he thought of was impossible, but surely one could be found. So turning over the names of schools, he sat for a long while holding his dear wife's hand, till at length, still weeping, she got up and went away, and then slowly he awoke. But even when he had opened his eyes and looked about him, he was thinking of schools, saying to himself that he must send them to a private academy, or even at the worst, engage a tutor.
Why, yes,
He said to himself, putting one foot out of bed.
that is what it must be, a tutor, though even then there will be a difficulty at first.
At those words, he wondered what difficulty there would be, and recollected that they were not ordinary children. No, they were foxes, mere foxes. When poor Mr. Trubrick had remembered this, he was, as it were, dazed or stunned by the fact, and for a long time he could understand nothing, but at last burst into a flood of tears compassionating them, and himself too. The awfulness of the fact itself, that his dear wife should have foxes instead of children, filled him with agony of pity, and at length, when he recollected the cause of their being foxes, that is, that his wife was a fox also, his tears broke out anew. And he could bear it no longer, but began calling out in his anguish, and beat his head once or twice against the wall, and then cast himself down on his bed again and wept, sometimes tearing the sheets asunder with his teeth. The whole of that day, for he was not to go to the earth till evening, he went about sorrowfully, torn by true pity for his poor vixen and his children. At last, when the time came, he went again up to the earth, which he found deserted, but hearing his voice out came Esther. But though he called the others by their names, there was no answer, and something in the way the cub greeted him made him fancy she was indeed alone. She was truly rejoiced to see him, and scrambled up into his arms, and thence to his shoulder, kissing him, which was unusual in her, though natural enough in her sister Angelica. He sat down a little way from the earth, fondling her, and fed her with some fish he had brought for her mother, which she ate so ravenously that he concluded she must have been short of food that day, and probably alone for some time. At last, while he was sitting there, Esther pricked up her nose, started up, and presently Mr. Trubrick saw his vixen come towards him. She greeted him very affectionately, but it was plain had not much time to spare, for she soon started back whence she had come with Esther at her side. When they had gone about a rod, the cub hung back and kept stopping and looking back to the earth, and at last turned and ran back home. But her mother was not to be fobbed off so. for she quickly overtook her child and, gripping her by the scruff, began to drag her along with her. Mr. Trubrick, seeing then how matters stood, spoke to her, telling her he would carry Esther if she would lead. So after a little while Sylvia gave her over, and then they set out on their strange journey. Sylvia went running on a little before, while Mr. Trubrick followed her with Esther in his arms, whimpering and struggling now to be free. And indeed, once she gave him a nip with her teeth. This was not so strange a thing to him now, and he knew the remedy for it, which is much the same as the others whose tempers run too high, that is, a taste of it themselves. Mr. Trubrick shook her and gave her a smart little cuff, after which, though she sulked, she stopped her biting. They went thus above a mile, circling his house and crossing the highway until they gained a small covert that lay with some waste fields adjacent to it. And by this time it was so dark that it was all Mr. Trubrick could do to pick his way, for it was not always easy for him to follow where his vixen found a big enough road for herself. But at length they came to another earth, and by the starlight Mr. Trubrick could just make out the other cubs skylarking in the shadow. Now he was tired, but he was happy and laughed soft for joy. And presently his vixen coming to him, put her feet upon his shoulders as he sat on the ground, and licked him. And he kissed her back on the muzzle and gathered her in his arms, and rolled her in his jacket, and then laughed and wept by turns in the excess of his joy. All his jealousies of the night before were forgotten now. All his desperate sorrow of the morning and the horror of his dream were gone. What if they were foxes? Mr. Trubrick found that he could be happy with them. As the weather was hot, he lay out there all the night, first playing hide and seek with them in the dark till, missing his vixen and the cubs proving obstreperous, and was soon asleep. He was woken up soon after dawn by one of the cubs tugging at his shoelace in play. When he sat up, he saw two of the cubs standing near him on their hind legs, wrestling with each other. The other two were playing hide and seek round a tree trunk, and now Angelica let go his laces and came romping into his arm to kiss him and say good morning to him, then worrying the points of his waistcoat a little shyly after the warmth of his embrace. That moment of awakening was very sweet to him. The freshness of the morning, the scent of everything at the day's rebirth, the first beams of the sun upon a tree top near, and a pigeon rising into the air suddenly, all delighted him. Even though rough scent of the body of the cub in his arms seemed to him delicious. At that moment all human customs and institutions seemed to him nothing but folly. For said he,
I would exchange all my life as a man for my happiness now. And even now I retain almost all the ridiculous conception of a man. The beasts are happier. And I will deserve that happiness as best I can.
after he had looked at the cubs playing merrily, how, with soft stealth, one would creep behind another to bounce out and startle him, a thought came into Mr. Trubrick's head, and that was that these cubs were innocent. They were as stainless snow. They could not sin, for God has created them to be thus, and they could break none of his commandments. And he fancied also that men sin because they cannot be as the animals. Presently he got up full of happiness, and began making his way home when suddenly he came to a full stop and asked himself, what is going to happen to them? This question rooted him stockishly in a cold and deadly fear as if he had seen a snake before him. At last he shook his head and hurried on his path. Aye, indeed, what would become of his vixen and her children? This thought put him into such a fever of apprehension that he did his best not to think of it any more. But yet it stayed with him all that day and for weeks after, at the back of his mind, so that he was not careless in his happiness as before, but as it were trying continually to escape his own thoughts. This made him also anxious to pass all the time he could with his dear Sylvia, and therefore he began going out to them for more of the daytime. And then he would sleep the night in the woods also, as he had done that night. And so he passed several weeks, only returning to his house occasionally to get himself a fresh provision of food. But after a week or 10 days, at the new earth both his vixen and the cubs too got a new habit of roaming. For a long while back, as he knew, his vixen had been lying out alone most of the day, and now the cubs were all for doing the same thing. The earth, in short, had served its purpose, and was now distasteful to them, and they would not enter it unless pressed with fear. This new manner of their lives was an added grief to Mr. Trubrick, for sometimes he missed them for hours together, or for the whole day even, and not knowing where they might be was lonely and anxious. Yet his Sylvia was thoughtful for him too, and would often send Angelica or another of the cubs to fetch him to their new lair, or come herself if she could spare the time. For now they were all perfectly accustomed to his presence, and had come to look on him as their natural companion. And although he was in many ways irksome to them by scaring rabbits, yet they always rejoiced to see him when they had been parted from him. This friendliness of theirs was, you may be sure, the source of most of Mr. Dubrick's happiness at this time. Indeed, he lived now for nothing but his foxes. His love for his vixen has extended itself insensibly to include her cubs, and these were now his daily playmates, so that he knew them as well as if they had been his own children. With Selwyn and Angelica, indeed, he was always happy, and they were never so much as when they were with him. He was not stiff in his behavior either, but had learned by this time as much from his foxes as they had from him. Indeed, never was there a more curious alliance than this, or now with stranger effects upon both of the parties. Mr. Trubrick now could follow after them anywhere, and keep up with them too, and could go through a wood as silently as deer. He learned to conceal himself if ever a labourer passed by so that he was rarely seen, and never but once in their company. But what was most strange of all, he had got a way of going doubled up, often almost on all fours with his hands touching the ground every now and then, and particularly when he went uphill. He hunted with them too sometimes, chiefly by coming up and scaring rabbits toward where the cubs lay ambushed, so that the bunnies ran straight into their jaws. He was useful to them in other ways, climbing up and robbing pigeons' nests for the egg, which they relished exceedingly, or by occasionally dispatching a hedgehog for them so they did not get the prickles in their mouths. But while on his part he thus altered his conduct, they on their side were not behindhand, but learned a dozen human tricks from him that are ordinarily wanting in Reynard's education. One evening he went to a cottager who had a row of skeps, and bought one of them, just as it was after the man had smothered the bees. This he carried to the foxes, that they might taste the honey, for he had seen them dig out wild bees' nests often enough. The scapful was indeed a wonderful feast for them. They bite greedily into the heavy scented comb, their jaws were drowned into the sticky flood of sweetness, and they gorged themselves on it without restraint. When they had crunched up the last morsel, they tore the scab in pieces, and for hours afterwards they were happily employed in licking themselves clean. That night he slept near their lair, but they left him and went hunting. In the morning when he woke he was quite numb with cold, and faint with hunger. A white mist hung over everything and the wood smelt of autumn. He got up and stretched his cramped limbs, and then walked homewards. The summer was over, and Mr. Trubrick noticed this now for the first time and was astonished. He reflected that the cubs were fast growing up. They were foxes at all points. And yet, when he thought of the time when they had been sooty and had blue eyes, it seemed to him only yesterday. From that, he passed to thinking of the future, asking himself, as he had done once before, what would become of his vixen and her children. Before the winter, he must tempt them into the security of his garden and fortify it against all the dangers that threatened them. But though he tried to allay his fear with such resolutions, he remained uneasy all that day. When he went out to them that afternoon, he found only his wife Sylvia there, and it was plain to him that she too was alarmed. But alas, poor creature! She could tell him nothing, only lick his hand and face, and turn about pricking her ears at every sound.
Where are your children, Sylvia?
He asked her several times, but she was impatient of his questions. But at last sprang into his arms, flattened herself upon his breast, and kissed him gently, so that when he departed his heart was lighter because he knew that she still loved him. That night he slept indoors, but in the morning early he was awoken by the sound of trotting horses, and running to the window saw a farmer riding by very sprucely dressed. Could they be hunting so soon? He wondered, but presently reassured himself that it could not be a hunt already. He heard no other sound till 11 o'clock in the morning, when suddenly there was the clamour of hounds giving tongue, and not so far off neither. At this Mr. Trubrick ran out of his house distracted, and set open the gates of his garden, but with iron bars and wire at the top so the huntsman could not follow. There was silence again. It seems the fox must have turned away, for there was no other sound of the hunt. Mr. Trubrick was now like one helpless with fear. He dared not to go out, yet could not stay still at home. There was nothing that he could do, yet he would not admit this, so he busied himself in making the holes in the hedges, so that Sylvia or her cubs could enter from whatever side she came. At last he forced himself to go indoors and sit down and drink some tea. While he was there, he fancied he heard the hounds again. It was but a faint ghostly echo of their music, yet when he ran out of the house it was already close at hand in the copse above. Now it was that poor Mr. Trubrick made his great mistake. For hearing the hounds almost outside the gate, he ran to meet them, whereas rightly he should have run back to the house. As soon as he reached the gate, he saw his wife Sylvia coming towards him, but very tired with running, and just upon her the hounds. The horror of that sight pierced him. Forever after he was haunted by those hounds, their eagerness, their desperate efforts to gain on her, and their blind lust for her came at odd moments to frighten him all his life. Now he should have run back, though it was already late, but instead he cried out to her, and she ran straight through the open gate to him. What followed was all over in a flash, but it was seen by many witnesses. The side of Mr. Trubrick's garden there is bounded by a wall, about 6 feet high and curving round, so that the huntsman could see over this wall inside. One of them indeed put his horse at it very boldly, which was risking his neck, and although he got over safe, was too late to be much of assistance. His vixen had at once sprung into Mr. Trubrick's arms, and before he could turn back, the hounds were upon them, and had pulled them down. Then at that moment there was a scream of despair, heard by all the field that had come up, which they declared afterward was more like a woman's voice than a man's. But yet there was no clear proof whether it was Mr. Trubrick or his wife who had suddenly regained her voice. When the huntsman who had leapt the wall got to them and had whipped off the hounds, Mr. Trubrick had been terribly mauled and was bleeding from 20 wounds. As for his vixen, she was dead, though he was still clasping her body into his arms. Mr. Trubrick was carried into the house at once and assistance sent for, but there was no doubt now about his neighbours being in the right when they called him mad. For a long while his life was despaired of, but at last he rallied, and in the end he recovered his reason and lived to be a great age. For that matter, he is still alive. End of the story. Lady into Fox by David Garnett.